Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video I'm continuing my analysis into metropolitan conflict. We're on page 20 of my notes. This is section 1.8, and it's on forced concentration. I'll explain what this concept is and how it applies to our existing body of knowledge with respect to metropolitan conflict. With that, let's begin. This is section 1.8. Okay. So forced concentration. This idea of forced concentration comes from conflict in metropolitan areas. The citation is at the bottom of page 20, so you can read the citation and get the article for yourself. Is it an article? Yeah, it's an article. So forced concentration is the attempt to artificially influence conditions in the housing market to create a concentration of targeted selected group members. It's the way in which, via zoning laws and pricing, we artificially create a condition to either, and we'll see this in a bit so I don't want to go too far ahead, to either preserve the racial characteristic or, probably more appropriately, the socioeconomic characteristic of a particular area, and exclude another. So two key concepts with respect to forced concentration here immediately, and I'll sort of bolster this as we go on. Two key concepts in terms of forced concentration. One, it is one of preservation, and two, it is one of exclusion, which are simultaneously functional. So both are simultaneously functional. Some groups is attempting to preserve their social advantages, economic advantages. There's an attempt to preserve the privilege established as a consequence of any number of social relations, while simultaneously excluding others from the opportunity to participate in those social advantages, from the opportunity to experience, to have economic social privilege. So both things are simultaneously functional in terms of forced concentration. So for example, the intent to create a condition in violation of Section 804 of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which is listed below. So I'm not going to read all of these, but the first is a refusal to sell or rent, right? After the making of a bona fide offer. You can imagine that a family has, and this is more in terms of race, obviously, because it's a Civil Rights Act. So you can imagine a middle-class black family has the credit and the money to live in a particular community. They go to seek residence in that community, find a realtor and such, and are excluded as a consequence of their race. Now, in terms of sexuality, are excluded as a consequence of their sexuality. Two homosexual couples, or one homosexual couple seeks to gain residence in a particular community, and as a consequence of the fact that they're gay, they are excluded from that community. Their exclusion from that community preserves the community, right? So both are functional. You can't have a preservation of affluence. You can't have a preservation of privilege without simultaneously excluding access to privilege, access to the benefits. So the gay couple comes up, man and man, woman and woman, what have you, and says, hey, we have a kid, we have a dog, we have the car, we're trying to live the American dream. Not in my community, that's not going to happen. Their exclusion is an attempt to preserve the heterosexual, homogeneous nature, the heterosexual homogeneous nature of the community, as just an example. So, number two, to discriminate against any person in terms, conditions, privileges, sales or rental of a dwelling, or in the provision of services, or facilitating the connection therein because of race, color, religion, sex, family status, or national origin. Sexuality would need to be, and I would imagine that sexuality is in a revised version of this. I'm sure that it is. You can't also discriminate in terms of sexuality. So nothing really there to elaborate on. There's no theory there. It's just discrimination is not acceptable. Next page, top of page 21, number 3. To make, print, publish, or cause to be made, print, or published, anything indicating preference, right? Anything indicating a discrimination. So for this residence, we're looking for a nice Protestant white family with 2 kids and a dog. Obviously, sort of, it sounds corny to even say this, but you know, you'd be surprised what you find in the real world. Number 4, to represent to any person because of race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, or national origin, that a dwelling is not available for inspection, and when in fact it is. Right, so you can't say that, oh well, no, this thing has just been sold. Well, you know, I just saw it today, posted, I thought it was open, I thought I could, you know, preview the house, you know, I'm interested in buying it. Oh, no, someone already bought it, when in fact it is available, right? Why? Because you're excluding members from inclusion. Why? Because you're preserving that property for someone else. This bias it'll get you locked up, you're breaking the law if you're doing it. So, for profit, to induce or attempt to induce any person to sell or to rent any dwelling by representation regarding the entry or prospective entry into the neighborhood for a person or persons, blah, 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 blah. So, to induce or attempt to induce any person to sell or rent. So, like, you really need to sell. You might not want to stay here. We're going to bully you out of your house. And this bullying you out of your property, you see this in, like, mafia movies all the time, right? They need this place in order to build some new project, and the fact that you're there, you're the last one standing in the community, and why are you being so stubborn? You need to leave so that I can get this project done. You hear about this sort of cliched position all the time. Can't do it. It's illegal. Number 6, to discriminate in the sale or rental or to otherwise make unavailable or deny a dwelling to any buyer or renter because of handicap. And obviously we have a more robust discussion on this with respect to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, but handicapped also is a bias. Again, handicap, race, religion, ethnicity, sex, and sexuality, these things are imperative. We need to make sure that we aren't excluding, because what we do then in the process of excluding is we force concentration. So you can imagine that if we're talking about the city and we're talking about the burbs, if I'm seeking to leave the city and reside in the burbs and I am being excluded here, then my option is to go back into the city. And thus I increase the concentration of low-income housing, because that's pretty much all I'm going to find in the city. So despite the fact that I could otherwise afford something better for myself, since I can't get residence in the burbs as a process of exclusion, I go back to the inner city, and the likelihood that I'm going to live in increased low, I did this in the last video, income, right, an increase of low-income housing in the inner city. What does it do? What does it do? It preserves, right? There's a preservation of the homogeneous character of the suburbs, and thus a preservation of the homogeneous character of the city. There is middle income, upper middle income, and maybe even to an extent affluence in the suburbs. There's either really low or really high in the city, and this homogeneity is what's at stake here. And all we need to do is we need to have a more heterogeneous, diversified socioeconomic representation in both the city and the burbs. Okay, so some of the effects of forced concentration then. This is the middle of page 21. Number 1, note the act of targeting a group based on any of these listed characteristics is also an act of selection. You are, in terms of denying someone representation, in terms of telling them that it's already sold when it's not, in terms of telling them that it's been reserved for someone else so they can't live here and such. You are selecting, you're targeting a population. You're targeting blacks, you're targeting Mexicans, you're targeting poor people, you're targeting whoever. That is, it is inherently implied, it is inherently implied that the rental dwelling is being, quote unquote, reserved for individuals of an accepted or proper social, racial, ethnical, religious, political demography. And this becomes, inherently arbitrary, right? A different realtor, a different agent might be less inclined to discriminate, and thus we need federal legislation to ensure that these discriminatory practices don't occur. Number two, and this is important, the effects then of forced concentration are twofold. One, it keeps the right people from living in the wrong places, and two, it keeps the wrong people from living in the right places. And that's what I think is at stake here, right? That's the easy sort of ghetto philosophy way of understanding all of this otherwise rather technical information, is that the right people, it keeps the wrong people from living in the right place. So the wrong people, inner city, poor, impoverished, blacks, minorities, keeps the wrong people from living in the right places, in the burbs. But it also keeps the right people from living in the wrong place, right? It keeps and preserves the insulation of the suburbs, which would disincentivize anyone of middle income or affluent communities. Why would I want to go live in the hood? I don't want to live in the hood, right? So it keeps the right people from going to the wrong place. What we need to do is we need to transform both, and I already talked at length at how we can go about a twofold transformation of this, both in the suburbs and in the city central. So regulating and localizing social demography. Number one, in the former, the wrong place typically becomes identified with the ghetto, that is, the inner city. And the wrong people are procedurally forced into localized, undervalued, and often destitute neighborhoods, right? So, I might actually get into writing about this stuff because it just rings well, right? And it's true, right? You're forced as a consequence of forced concentration, not because of inability to afford the housing, which is critically important. This is a consequence of the systemic procedural practice of targeting and excluding those who would otherwise be viable residents from residents. That's what we're talking about. So thus, they are systematically concentrated and identifiable geographic area, right? There is a systematically designed geographical area for poor people, and it's there. That's where the poor people live. This is problematic because, as I said in the last section, when we talk about managing poverty, you minimize the representation of poverty in a community as a consequence of the statistical facts associated with, and there's many variables directly associated with poverty. But in terms of people, we don't do that with people, right? Just because you're poor doesn't mean that, one, you're always going to be poor, and two, doesn't mean that your poverty, your condition of poverty is itself some type of contagion. It means that there are potentially ways in which we, regulators, city planners, policymakers, can create conditions that will afford you an opportunity. We're not just going to cut a check and say that, hey, now you're equal because you can pay your bills just like I can. That only lasts for so long. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a system in which you will undeniably have the opportunity to compete and to excel and to socially climb the ladder where you otherwise would not have that. That's what's at stake here, right? Number two, in the latter, keeping, quote-unquote, them out of the right place is also an attempt to preserve the social demography of, quote-unquote, the right communities by procedurally excluding these persons from inclusion. Next page, top of page 22, and this is me. So within the context of genocide, and this actually came out of my genocidal intent book. I don't remember writing this, so I'm going to see what I wrote, how this applied. I have no idea why I put this in there. The attempt by the state, the attempt probably by state officials to artificially construct and regulate the natural, okay, I remember why I did this now. So the attempt by state officials to artificially construct and regulate the natural dispersion of demographic identifiers, sort of the stuff that pops up on census data, is the political construction of the social. The political construction of the social is the attempt to artificially construct demographic identifiers, right? We want the poor people living here, we want the rich people living here, we want the Christians over here, Muslims over here, Haitians over here, Cubans over there, right? You are artificially constructing the representation of people, not poverty or not ideas or concepts, but people as a consequence of how we identify them through their demography in particular geographic locations, which unfolds as the political power, as those in political power attempt to forcefully regulate demographic identifiers within the population with hopes of achieving homogeneous social demography. And this is probably why I've been, for the last hour or so, talking about homogenization. And it is true, probably in the back of my mind, I must have been thinking about this. I forgot that I had written on this. But in my book on genocidal intent, obviously with much more significant, much more heinous implications, it's exactly the same. Part of Nazi Germany's incentive to construct ghettos was to localize Jewish victims, potential Jewish victims, in an isolated geographic area as a means of containment, as a means of surveillance, and as a means of disincentivizing and eventually nullifying any social inclusion or social assimilation, right? So that, hey, we're going to disincentivize to the German people, hey, don't talk to the Jews, they're dirty, they're evil, they're thieves, they're dangerous. We've localized them in this area, and you don't want to go into that area, right? That's where the Jews live. Now, that disincentivization dehumanizes the other, and as a consequence, it facilitates that dehumanization, facilitates their extermination. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily the case, but there's a correlation, so correlation is no demonstration of proof, is an increased probability. But that probability is very high, you better believe it. Similarly, and I don't want you to think that this is tangential, because it's not. Similarly, if we have, I erased it, but if we have systemic processes in place to preserve the homogenized distinction between those who have and those who have not, and these homogenized distinctions aren't conceptual, they're localized within our geography. Poor people live there, rich people, middle class people live here and there. What we've done is we've created a social system that is used to operationalize that dichotomous relationship, right? Our social system is in place to ensure that, no, there will always be a condition that they live there and we live here. What we need to recognize is we put into practice, we are the conduits with which this operationalization manifested itself, and thus we can change it at whim. What we need to do is not kumbaya, all roast marshmallows. I'm not here preaching. I'm not interested in that. I don't think kumbaya is possible. This is why it's called Metropolitan conflict, because conflict is inherent. The conflict is one of poverty. What we're talking about is poverty. Getting a handle on poverty is good not only for sort of the minimization of its representation within our national distribution of wealth. We want that number statistically low, but it's good for poor people. Not only is it good for poor people, it's good for our nation. Why? Because of tax dollars and industry and blah, 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 blah. Thus, what we need to recognize is we need to forfeit, we need to relinquish this belief in poor people live here, rich people live here, and create social conditions in which we can have an infusion of middle-class lifestyle and living in the inner city, which is certainly doable. Anybody who lives in New York City proper can talk to this. It's not so apparent here in Florida. It's very clearly demarcated. It's extremely clearly demarcated in Florida. In New York, you can see more of this heterogeneous socioeconomic relations. One block is this, around the corner is that. So there can be an infusion, an enticement for an infusion of middle-class lifestyles and communities in the inner city, but there can also be a representation of low-income housing in the suburbs. That's what's at stake here, right? And that creates a heterogeneous, not only social relations, but there is a diversification of socioeconomic strata, right? There isn't just clearly block, we're from here to here and they live there. Those poor people, they live there. That becomes problematic. We tend to dehumanize others as a consequence of just knowing Oh, well, where do you live? South of so-and-so? North of so-and-so? West of that? Oh, I know the type of people who live in that community. No, no, no. It's not a good guy. I can't trust this dude or this chick. Number 3, top of page 22. So in many central cities, neighborhoods, poverty and deprivation are overwhelming because of the dominance of the local environment, right? And I like that idea of, there's something about that even now, it still resonates with me, the dominance of poverty on the environment. And, you know, I would encourage, I don't know why this just popped into my head, but I would encourage not only just social theorists, but I would encourage artists to take this up. It would be very interesting, like if I was an art teacher, I can see assigning my students like a guerrilla art project, like go into communities and look at the dominance of poverty on the environment. You can think of sort of poverty anthropomorphized with like sullied boots, walking in on like dandelions, right? Just soiling everything, and just you know what poverty looks like. It's the crack house. It's the smell of urine. I don't want to associate it necessarily with graffiti, because representation of graffiti, right? It's dingy, it's dirty, it's loud, it's cantankerous. It's that, right? It's putrid. That's when we think poverty. That's what we think. And this environment is the environment in which people then live. A lot of that association is completely open to transformation, such that you can be poor. And, you know, as being a Jamaican, I can tell you for myself, a lot of Caribbeans are like this, right? A lot of quote-unquote, third world immigrants are like this. Yeah, we're poor. My mom used to tell me this all the time. Yeah, we might be poor. And she was honest, because we were dirt poor. We were dirt poor. My mom made maybe $19,000, $20,000, and it was 7 of us. Super poor. But she was like, but we're going to be clean. Right? Despite the fact that we're poor, it doesn't mean that there is an inherency between being poor and smelling like urine, or being poor and not putting yourself together well, or being poor. That inherency is problematic, because people are naturally averse to the smell of urine, if you will, the sight of something decaying, the repugnance of left out garbage and such. We're naturally, biologically averse to these things. This is part of our evolutionary well, we don't have to necessarily get an evolution, but this is part of who we've become, right? In terms of poverty, we need to recognize that just making the community, very minimal investment in the community, painting the walls, cleaning up the streets, making sure the neighborhood looks a little bit better, is something significant. And the beauty of art is that art allows us to stop for a second and recognize, you know, I expected to see some trash left out, and somebody just put an art installment in the middle of nowhere. This is the hood. There you got an art installment. Oh my goodness, this is nice. Community development also that I've seen recently, not so much in terms of art installments, but in terms of urban gardening. I didn't put it in here. Shout out to all the urban gardeners, right? That's a good approach, right? Not in terms of, you know, sort of eating tomatoes out the damn ground. I mean, that's good and all, but, you know, I like my beef. But more important is just, wow, it's nice to see something growing, alive, and not concrete everywhere, right? It's good to see that someone's taking the time to nurture this life form, and it's in the middle of an urban jungle. Pac talks about the rose that grew between the concrete. Both poetically and both figuratively and literally, that image of the rose that grew through the concrete is something, it's always stuck with me with Pac, right? I'm always channeling Pac, because I recognize that you can have both. You can have a representation of the concrete jungle, of the inner city, of the ghetto, but you can also recognize that there's potential in the ghetto, right? That there's beauty in the ghetto, that there's aesthetics and aesthetic beauty there. Hip-hop and the music that I love so much generated from this otherwise dilapidated, ramshackled, abandoned, you know, space. And look what it created. If you think of Harlem Renaissance and art and the literature that came out of the ghetto communities and urban communities, a lot comes out of there. The way in which we talk, the way in which we wear clothes, the way in which we paint. A lot of things that we take for granted now came out of urban ghetto communities. And it's important to make sure that we preserve the ghetto. right? It shouldn't look like the burbs. It should be, there's going to be some ghetto as an inherency of poverty, right? So don't think that, oh, there shouldn't be any ghetto. No, yeah, there's going to be a ghetto. You better believe it, unless capitalism falls, which is not especially in my life. I don't think it's going to fall ever, but whatever. So there's going to be a ghetto, but it doesn't have to look and smell like piss and shit, right? There can be a ghetto, but you can be poor and be clean, right? So I think that's, I can't stress that enough. I think in terms of our aesthetics and the way in which ghetto communities handle themselves and take care of their community, very, very small investments can help a lot. In terms of church organizations of any denomination, of any religious belief, this is a good thing for church. Very, very low economic investment. You get some paint, go out there and paint something. Spend a couple $100 and you do something to make the city bigger. So if you're a church leader or you're in a church community of any group, and if you're an atheist but you just want to do some good, because that's why I live if you're not doing good, then, go out there, get a few cans of paint, organize some people, paint some stuff, take care of some stuff. If you're an artist, do an art installment, try and beautify as little, as the smallest contributions, I really do believe can help, right? It's about incremental change, and all of us collectively making concerted effort can change. It won't stop poverty, but it can change the way in which people perceive themselves and their worth and their value in this poor community. Because I was poor as an adolescent and as a teenager until I left to college, and it wasn't until I started working that I pulled myself out of work ethic. But that is a consequence of the educational opportunities that I have. Part of one of the main incentives why I do these videos is because I recognize people can't afford to sit in my class and pay the money that's needed in order to learn from me. So I have an obligation, not for people who are quote unquote poor, but I've assumed a personal responsibility to make sure that if I teach it in my classes, I teach it for you guys. I teach it for the world, and you can have it for free. It's not about making money. More importantly, even if I don't teach it for classes, I have so many lecture series that I do only for YouTube, so you guys get more than everybody, right? I take it a little bit deeper in my residential classes and such, but that's a different story. So the structural integration of poverty, all of the maladies associated with, is this a quote? Yeah, where does the quote start? No, just the end is a quote, and I didn't put a page number, so forgive me for that. All of the maladies associated, so this part is me, all of the maladies associated with an oversaturation of localized poverty brings with it the usual social problems. Thus, maybe this isn't me. Thus, prior to 1968, this is the problem when you don't freaking use quotations, Jason, my bad. Thus, prior to 1968, the institutionalized practice of discrimination, particularly racial discrimination within the context of quote-unquote forced concentration, resulted in the quote dominance of poverty in some local environments, obviously, right? Because of zoning, because of gerrymandering, because of forced concentration, you have an attempt to preserve the homogeneity of maybe a white community or a middle-class affluent community. At the same time, simultaneously, I erased it, excluding others and keeping them concentrated in an impoverished community. This impoverished community is defined as such socioeconomically, but this impoverished community is also defined in terms of the impoverishment of opportunity. It is impoverishment in terms of what's another word? I feel like it's, I can't think of the word. It starts with an A right now. The application? I can't think of the word. But the impoverishment of the community in terms of its, and it's not abject. It's not abject. I can't, it'll come to me. But the impoverishment of the community in terms of its sort of disrepair, right? It's the sense of, and I hate, maybe I won't say that. I probably won't say that. But yeah, it's and I know what I was going to say now, but it's not sort of appropriate for public discussion. But yeah, it's the sense of the disrepair of the community. And it's important that we recognize that that disrepair can be repaired. And I think this is where, church communities, because there's so many of them in the inner city, I think church communities can do a lot of social good for a tiny, 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 tiny bit of money. It doesn't cost a lot to go get church communities together. Again, I'm not excluding atheists. Atheists, agnostics, jump on board, man. I'm a philosopher, you know how it goes. Everybody, jump on board. Church communities specifically, they'll go out, take a couple of bucks, go down to the neighbor. You don't have to necessarily do, sort of the homeless feeding and all that. You can just, you can paint and take care of graffiti problems. You can beautify a city. You can install some art. You can plant a garden. There's lots that can be done to take that what seems to be inherent association of disrepair with impoverishment and transform it so that you have an impoverished community, but the community isn't in disrepair, right? And thus, there's a certain sense of pride. My community is poor, but I'm proud of my community. Not my community is poor and I hate being here, right? There doesn't need to be that inherent association. And then lastly, number 5, for section 1.8, infrastructural persistence of poverty despite 1968 Civil Rights Act. Since many of these communities were formally established before 1968, this is me now, I remember writing this, the means with which they were established, irrespective of the now functional legal prohibition, preserves the strategic design to forcefully concentrate local environments with typically low-income minorities. What in the world, Dr. Campbell, does that mean? So, you have to think, prior to 1968 and the implementation of the Civil Rights Act, you have decades of systematic exclusionary practices which sought to preserve and exclude simultaneously. What happens after 1968 is that practice is abolished. Right? So we have the abolition of that practice. It in no sense negates the decades prior to 1968 of a fully functional social attempt to preserve exclusionary practices aimed at localizing blacks, minorities, impoverished communities, and isolating them from affluent, middle-class, quote-unquote, white communities. So that those social practices prior to 1968 were already in place and functional, and thus it is ludicrous to assume that because of the passage of this legislation that there weren't already operationally functional existing infrastructural concentration, right? Concentration within the infrastructure of selected and deselected groupings, right? There were concentrations of selected and deselected groupings within identified infrastructures, right? Within identified geographies. And it's something that we need to just, we just need to keep that in mind. It's very real. Here in Florida, there are, quote-unquote, the black communities. There are, quote-unquote, the white communities. Whites don't live in the black communities, and blacks don't live in the white communities. There isn't some fanciful, idealized attempt here, because this is me, and I'm so not that guy. I'm so realistic. To say, oh no, there has to, at every house has to be black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, black, white, Hispanic, and then we have LGBT community members, our communities. No, I mean, clearly that's not going to happen. You're going to have sort of entrenchment in communities. I get that. The idea is in terms of the future of our metropolitan development, the future of our metropolitan design. Since we're so many decades post-Civil Rights Act, we need to recognize that the future development, the future in which we build, the future of how we create our sky rises and our residential communities and our office buildings and our shopping malls, and all the development in the future absolutely needs to take into account inclusion. Because at the end of the day, the only color that matters is green, right? So if you're a developer, if you're a city planner, if you're a builder, why in the world would I want to? No, if people can afford the price to live in here, let them live here. right? If they can afford to pay the property tax to open their businesses here, then let them open their businesses there. If they're gay, if they're straight, if they're black, if they're Arabs, if they're Spanish, if they're white, doesn't matter. If they got green, they got credit, I'm ready to do business with them. That's America. That's what we do. That's what we do. So the idea is to create a condition for inclusion and allow us to transform the biases that we have, which tell us poor black people live in the city, affluent middle-class white people live in the burbs. Let's get rid of that, because it's a lie. Because it's a lie. I'm middle class and I live in the burbs, in the gated community. Okay, great. Doesn't mean that I don't want to live in the inner city. If there's an opportunity for me to relocate my family, I can live safely in a skyrise on the 30th or 40th floor and decrease my commute time. You think I'm not going to go? Of course I'm going to go. Right? There needs to be that opportunity, and it's up to city planners really and developers, existing developers and the next generation of developers, to recognize that we need to think about our metropolitan community in terms of its diversity and attempt to apply the most inclusive business models in order to maximize money. Just do it out of sheer greed, if nothing else, right? If you're not motivated like I am for social inclusion, you know, just get money from everywhere you can get it. And on that note, we're gonna end this lecture series, but this not the series, but this lecture section on get money. So, get money. I need to tell myself that too. I need to I'm gonna get some money in a little bit. With that, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.